What if I told you that love in the Middle Ages wasn't about flowers, poetry, or happy endings, but about suffering, control, and obsession? Imagine a world where stalking was considered romantic, where children were married off like property, and where the church declared pleasure itself sinful. This is not a fairy tale. This is medieval reality. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to see will make every modern romance look innocent by comparison. Back then, the nobility invented a philosophy of love that glorified pain. Courtly love turned unrequited desire into an art form. Knights would dedicate decades to a woman they could never possess, composing poems of agony, performing heroic deeds in her name, and living in self-imposed torment. The more they suffered, the more noble their devotion became. It was an emotional torture chamber dressed up as romance. And the women, they were trapped in a mirror of cruelty. A lady of the court had to remain aloof, cold, and distant to prove her virtue. Genuine affection was seen as vulgar, even shameful. The system demanded mutual misery. The knight pined endlessly, the lady maintained icy composure, and both were applauded for their devotion to suffering. Happiness was a sin, desire was a trap, and love was a performance of agony. Marriage wasn't a union of hearts. It was a business transaction. Parents arranged marriages for children as young as 7, negotiating land, livestock, and political alliances. A girl's worth was measured in dowries, acres, or cattle. The bride had little say, treated like property, her entire life subjected to the whims of patriarchal power. Love between partners was irrelevant. Loyalty to contracts and family interests came first, and if a bride failed to bear a male heir, she could be returned to her family like a defective tool. Many child brides never saw their parents again, shipped to foreign households as political pawns. These were marriages of convenience, alliances forged in cold calculation, and women were expected to accept their fate with gratitude. Human lives were currency, and love was the illusion layered over ownership. The church compounded the cruelty, declaring that sexual pleasure was sinful even within marriage. Desire itself was evil, a tool of Satan corrupting humanity. Couples were instructed to approach sex like medicine, quickly, dutifully, with guilt. Days for intimacy were strictly limited, excluding Sundays, religious holidays, Lent, Advent, menstruation, pregnancy, and breastfeeding, leaving roughly 40 days a year when sex was permitted, and even then it was a chore cloaked in moral terror. Women were blamed for men's desires, demonized as inherently lustful, and subjected to endless moral control. Marriage became a system of containment, a way to regulate the supposed dangers of female sexuality. Celibacy was preached as superior. Even married life was a near hellish compromise. Love, in its most basic human form, became a battlefield where guilt and obedience replaced passion and choice. Violence was central to romance. Knights didn't woo, they conquered. Kidnapping women they fancied was celebrated as the ultimate declaration of love, and tournaments weren't games, they were brutal spectacles designed to impress and intimidate. The bloodier the contest, the more romantic the act. Duels, wars, and acts of aggression were the standard by which devotion was measured. Gentle, peaceful men were seen as inferior, unworthy of affection. Women were treated as property trophies to be won in competitions and wars. Knights fought for their right to possess them, not for glory or honor. Love songs and literature framed women as prizes, their value measured in wealth and beauty, never in agency or desire. Adultery was considered theft of property, not emotional betrayal. Captured women were expected to accept their fate and even develop affection for their captors. And death, dying for love, was the ultimate romantic gesture. Tragic tales like Tristan and Isolde Lancelot and Guinevere, or Abelard and Heloise, weren't warnings, they were aspirational. Medieval nobles competed for the most heart-wrenching stories, engineering suffering, obstacles, and even mutual destruction. happiness was a peasant fantasy. True love required agony, heartbreak, and sometimes literal death, celebrated as the highest proof of devotion. Courtly love wasn't just emotional torment, it was a socially mandated performance. Knights were expected to display their suffering publicly, composing elegies and lamentations for the women who barely acknowledged their existence. Every sleepless night, every pang of longing was proof of refinement and dedication. To refuse this ritual of anguish was to be deemed uncultured, unworthy, even cowardly. Pain was prestigious. Suffering was art, and love was the canvas. Imagine a young knight barely out of boyhood dedicating years of his life to a woman already married or otherwise unattainable. He fights wars in her honor, pens sonnets to mourn her indifference, and descends into despair for the sake of social approval. The paradox: achieving the object of desire was considered vulgar, even lowly. True nobility lay in loving without hope, in crafting your misery into a display of sophistication. Meanwhile, noble women perfected the art of aloofness. A glance too warm, a word too kind, could diminish her status. She was trained to appear unattainable, to inspire obsessive longing without ever indulging it. Courtly etiquette turned the most basic human interactions into psychological chess, where every gesture could enhance or destroy reputations. In love, suffering was a currency, and women were the unwitting bankers of anguish. But love wasn't just performative, it was transactional. Parents measured the value of potential husbands by wealth, land, and military power. Young girls were pawns in this system, their desires irrelevant. Negotiations over marriages resembled high-stakes business deals. Property exchanges, dowries, and inheritance were meticulously detailed, leaving little room for emotion. Love was an afterthought, a garnish atop a carefully calculated political meal. If a woman's reproductive abilities failed to meet expectations, her marriage could be annulled, or she could be returned home in disgrace. Her body was evaluated as an asset, her life subordinated to lineage and inheritance. Children were wedded to secure alliances, debts, or military support. Romantic affection was not only unnecessary, it was potentially dangerous, a threat to the carefully structured system of power and property. Even within marriage, the Church imposed restrictions that turned intimacy into moral peril. Pleasure was sinful. Sexual desire was equated with the devil, and sex was regimented like a chore. Couples were instructed to abstain during religious observances, pregnancy, lactation, and even menstruation, severely limiting physical connection. Desire was treated as a psychological and spiritual threat, turning the most intimate human act into a test of obedience and self-control. Women bore the brunt of this ideology. Their sexuality was framed as a trap. Their desires condemned, their bodies policed by moral authority. Husbands were warned against succumbing to temptation, while wives were expected to suppress any natural inclination. Marriage became a battlefield, where control, guilt, and fear replaced intimacy and companionship. Love was a carefully monitored hazard rather than a mutual bond. Physical violence became the language of devotion. Knights didn't woo with words alone, they demonstrated love through the risk, combat, and conquest. A man who kidnapped his beloved or battled rivals for her favor was celebrated. The more dangerous the act, the more romantic it was considered. Consent was irrelevant. Admiration was measured by audacity. Love required domination, aggression, and endurance of extreme peril. Tournaments embodied this philosophy. They were violent theater, where men competed to demonstrate bravery and skill, often injuring themselves severely, all to win the admiration of women in the stands. These events weren't recreational. They were public proofs of devotion. Blood and danger validated the sincerity of love. Gentle gestures were dismissed as weak, brutality equated with desire. The system extended to war. Capturing women during raids often violently was framed as the pinnacle of romantic conquest. Literature romanticized such acts, portraying captives as eventually grateful and emotionally indebted to their captors. Women had no legal identity independent of men. They were property to be claimed, exchanged, and controlled. Love was not mutual. It was possession and assertion of dominance packaged as romance. The concept of consent was virtually non-existent. A woman's preference had little to no weight in the equation of romance. Fathers, husbands, and even the state dictated whom she would love, marry, or serve. Her role was to endure, obey, and beautify, while men competed for the privilege of controlling her. Emotional agency was a foreign notion. Her life was orchestrated like a finely tuned instrument in a courtly symphony of ownership. Medieval love songs might sound sweet, but they were coded messages of possession. Lyrics praised the lady's virtue while simultaneously affirming the lover's submission and torment. Yet behind the flowery language was an unmistakable assertion. The woman was an object, the man's devotion a transaction. Poetry was less about intimacy and more about signaling status refinement and mastery of suffering as a gentlemanly art. Adultery laws further cemented women's status as property. If a married woman engaged in a sexual relationship outside her marriage, it wasn't considered emotional betrayal, it was theft. Her body was legally an extension of her husband's assets. Punishments targeted her, not the other man, reinforcing the notion that romantic and sexual ownership belonged to males, and that deviation was a crime against property, not personhood. The rite of the first night, or jus primae noctis, exemplified this twisted logic. Feudal lords were legally allowed to sleep with brides on their wedding night, a claim framed as a test of valor and honor. The bride's feelings were irrelevant. The spectacle was about power submission and social order. Romance in this context meant enduring or participating in systemic domination, a grim ritual disguised as aristocratic tradition. Violence and dominance weren't just tolerated, they were celebrated. Knights were lauded for physical prowess, aggression, and the ability to instill fear even among those they claimed to love. Medieval literature reinforced this, portraying gentlemen as weak and undesirable. Strength, cruelty, and relentless pursuit became the markers of romantic legitimacy, shaping social norms and psychological expectations across the upper echelons of society. Women were trained to be both desirable and distant. A lady's beauty was a weapon, but so was her indifference. Showing affection too openly was considered vulgar. Withholding it was virtuous. Men were expected to suffer women to withhold, and society applauded the resulting misery. Emotional suffering was not a byproduct of love. It was the primary goal, a socially sanctioned measure of refinement and nobility. Marriage itself was a survival exercise. Girls as young as 7 could be betrothed, sent to distant households, and forced into unions with strangers. Their personal feelings, happiness, or well-being were secondary to strategic alliances. Families prioritized land wealth and political advantage over emotional bonds, turning domestic life into a meticulously calculated arena for power negotiation and human logistics. The Church compounded these constraints. Religious authorities condemned natural sexual pleasure as sinful, promoting guilt and repression. Intimacy became a duty performed under duress rather than mutual enjoyment. Desire was morally suspect, and marital relations were regulated with strict calendars and prohibitions. Love was morally subservient to doctrine, reducing the most human of drives to a controlled, guilt-laden chore. Female sexuality was demonized. Women were simultaneously blamed for men's desires and punished for their own. Marriage acted as a mechanism of containment, ensuring that women's bodies and impulses remained under male and ecclesiastical oversight. Pleasure was a threat, and virtue was measured by obedience and emotional restraint. Love, in this context, became a carefully monitored, heavily policed, and often terrifying institution. Death was the ultimate validation of romantic devotion. Tragic endings were glorified. Survival and contentment were seen as unremarkable or even suspect. Literature celebrated lovers who destroyed each other through passion, reinforcing the idea that intensity equated to suffering. Aristocrats competed for the most catastrophic love stories, striving to emulate legendary examples like Tristan and Isolde, where agony, loss, and mortality were marks of true devotion. The medieval imagination treated heartbreak as a literal, physical threat. Medical texts of the time described lovesickness as a disease capable of killing the afflicted. Remedies ranged from bloodletting to exorcisms, demonstrating just how seriously society took the idea that emotional torment could and should be deadly. To live without suffering was considered shallow, even morally suspect. Courtly love demanded performance above all else. Every sigh, glance, and poem was an exhibition of refined agony. Knights prided themselves on sleepless nights, loss of appetite, and obsessive longing, treating emotional devastation as a badge of honor. Women, in turn, were expected to reward this torment with distant admiration or controlled rejection, maintaining the elaborate dance of misery that defined aristocratic romance. Children, particularly girls, were pawns in dynastic chess games. Betrothals arranged before puberty determined life paths, often isolating young brides from family and friends. The unfamiliar households they entered could be cold, cruel, or indifferent, reducing the child to a vessel for political and economic strategy. Love autonomy and consent were irrelevant, survival and compliance were paramount. Dowries codified female value. A woman's worth was quantified in land, livestock, and wealth, turning marriage into a transaction akin to livestock trade. Failure to produce male heirs could result in repudiation or economic penalties, underscoring how women were treated as commodities rather than human beings. Personal choice was subordinate to social, economic, and political imperatives. The public spectacle of tournaments fused romance and violence. Knights fought viciously to demonstrate courage, skill, and desirability, while ladies observed as if at entertainment events. Blood injury and near-death experiences were romanticized, teaching men and women alike that love was inseparable from risk and brutality. Physical domination was proof of emotional devotion. Even everyday interactions were governed by this culture of torment. Courtiers engaged in subtle competitions to display restraint, patience, and suffering. A lady's fleeting kindness could intensify a suitor's torment. Her indifference could elevate his social prestige. The emotional economy of medieval love was one of calculated deprivation and strategic agony. Religious authorities reinforced psychological oppression. Sexual desire was equated with sin, pleasure with corruption, and marriage with a moral compromise. Couples navigated an intricate calendar of forbidden days, and any enjoyment was suspect. The Church's teachings created a climate in which love was perpetually fraught with guilt, fear, and anxiety, transforming intimacy into a battleground of moral regulation. Women faced double jeopardy. Their own desire was dangerous, and men's desire was uncontrollable. They were instructed to be chaste and virtuous, yet simultaneously tantalizing. Failure to adhere to these impossible standards could have social, economic, or even physical consequences. Love was a system of control, dictating emotions, behavior, and bodily autonomy. Romantic literature codified suffering as a measure of authenticity. The more extreme the agony, the more noble the love. Works of poetry and prose instructed nobles in emotional self-harm, portraying unrequited longing, jealousy, and obsessive devotion as aspirational ideals. Happiness was mundane, suffering was aristocratic. These texts were not merely stories, they were manuals for living a life steeped in pain and prestige. The medieval obsession with fatal romance influenced social norms and personal expectations. Young nobles internalized the idea that true love required self-destruction. Choosing a compatible partner, negotiating mutual respect, or cultivating shared happiness was secondary to demonstrating the intensity of suffering. Emotional devastation became a metric of refinement, status, and nobility. Marriage functioned primarily as an economic and political tool. Love was incidental, often dangerous if pursued openly. Families arranged unions to secure alliances, consolidate wealth, or settle disputes, treating women as strategic assets. Genuine affection was suspicious. Mutual desire was seen as a potential threat to social order. The concept of consent was nearly non-existent. Children, especially girls, were bound by contracts negotiated by adults who had no interest in their preferences. A young bride could be sent to a foreign household entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill and her family's willingness to tolerate her plight. Autonomy was subordinated to property and power. Church doctrine reinforced a culture of fear and guilt. Sexual activity, even within marriage, was morally fraught. Pleasure was sinful desire, was devilish, and physical intimacy was to be endured rather than enjoyed. Couples had to navigate religious calendars that prohibited intercourse on numerous days, turning natural affection into a disciplined act of obedience. Women bore the brunt of moral responsibility. Female sexuality was portrayed as inherently dangerous, a potential trap for men's souls. Men's desires were legitimized, but women were punished for expressing theirs. This dual standard reinforced the objectification of women, limiting their agency while simultaneously making them the focus of societal anxiety. The rite of the first night, or jus primae noctis, while perhaps exaggerated in historical accounts, symbolized the intersection of power and romance. The notion that a lord could claim a bride on her wedding night was framed as a test of honor and loyalty, embedding violence within the language of love. Romance and domination were inseparable in cultural imagination. Courtly literature celebrated dramatic, violent displays of devotion. Knights kidnapped, fought, and risked death to prove love. The more extreme the act, the more socially esteemed it became. Women were expected to admire bravery and conquest, linking attraction directly to dominance and aggression. Gentlemen, as modern sensibilities might understand them, were considered unworthy of affection. Women's status as property was central. Love was a competitive sport where men sought to possess the most valuable prizes. Legal and social structures treated women as transferable assets, with adultery framed as theft rather than betrayal. Romance language mirrored property contracts, equating affection with ownership and fidelity with control. Captivity and abduction were romanticized. Women captured in raids or wars were depicted in literature as falling in love with their captors. Trauma was reframed as romance, and women's agency was negated. The narrative glorified domination and conquest, embedding the idea that love was earned through suffering and subjugation. Love, in this context, was a performance. Emotional suffering, social compliance, and the display of restraint became public spectacles. Nobles measured devotion by intensity of torment, with recognition and admiration tied to visible demonstrations of self-inflicted pain. Happiness and mutual fulfillment were considered mundane, unworthy of elite attention. Fatalism defined romantic ideals. Tragic love stories set cultural expectations that death, despair, and destruction were the highest expressions of devotion. Literary heroes and heroines perished for love, and real-life aristocrats emulated these narratives. Happiness was for commoners. Nobility equated romantic tragedy with refinement and virtue. Medieval nobility embraced self-destruction as proof of love. Heartbreak was not only expected, but celebrated. Physicians of the era diagnosed lovesickness as a fatal condition, prescribing remedies that ranged from bloodletting to exorcism. Romantic death was considered noble, even aspirational. Stories of lovers committing mutual destruction were common. Tristan and Isolde Lancelot and Guinevere Abelard and Heloise, these tales glorified suffering and societal defiance. Young nobles often orchestrated their own melodramatic obstacles, deliberately courting tragedy to align with literary ideals. Courtly love demanded secrecy and discretion. Public acknowledgement of romantic desire could jeopardize social standing. The ritualized pursuit of an often unattainable partner elevated longing over fulfillment, making unrequited passion more esteemed than marital or mutual satisfaction. Letters and poems circulated among elites as evidence of devotion. Troubadours composed elaborate verses detailing anguish, desire, and unattainable yearning. Emotional suffering became a social currency, and those who expressed it most convincingly gained prestige, admiration, and a reputation for refined sensibility. Marital unions were secondary to social performance. A husband's affection mattered less than strategic advantage. Dowries, inheritance, and political alliances dictated choices, and personal happiness was often sacrificed for familial and societal benefit. Love, when present, was carefully choreographed and constrained by duty. Violence extended beyond knights and tournaments. Duels, feuds, and raids were justified as demonstrations of romantic commitment. Aggression signaled strength, determination, and loyalty. Gentle behavior was seen as inadequate, and excessive force became normalized within the cultural script of courtship. Women internalized expectations of passivity and restraint. Affection, ambition, or desire could undermine social standing. Coldness was interpreted as virtue, vulnerability as weakness. Psychological control maintained the system, ensuring compliance and perpetuating male dominance under the guise of refined romance. Property laws codified gender inequality. A woman's identity was legally tied to her male relatives. She could not own land, enter contracts independently, or testify in court without male oversight. Romance therefore functioned as a facade over systemic control, disguising ownership as affection. Marriage and courtship merged into a performance of suffering ownership and societal theater. Public displays of agony, conquest, or devotion were expected. Love was performative, regulated, and deeply entwined with social hierarchies. Emotional authenticity was less valued than adherence to cultural ideals. Tragic narratives were educational tools. Nobles learned from literary examples how to love destructively, how to endure, and how to impose suffering as a mark of refinement. Happiness, cooperation, and mutual care were dismissed as common or unworthy of those considered socially and culturally elite. Medieval literature constantly reinforced the notion that love required extreme commitment, often manifesting as self-harm or social defiance. Young nobles were taught to idealize unfulfilled desire, transforming private longing into public spectacle. The ideal lover was tormented yet persistent. Sleep deprivation, fasting, and emotional turmoil were worn as badges of honor. Enduring agony for another person was considered the pinnacle of sophistication and moral virtue. Romantic gestures were ritualized and often grotesque by modern standards. Sending love tokens, composing agonizing verses, and participating in symbolic battles served as proofs of devotion. Each act reinforced social hierarchy while showcasing individual emotional refinement. Consent was almost irrelevant. Women were expected to submit to social scripts rather than personal preference. Courting rituals were designed to display male courage, wealth, and endurance, with female reactions interpreted as either confirmation or challenge to masculine prowess. Adultery laws revealed the transactional nature of medieval love. A woman's infidelity was considered theft, not betrayal of emotional intimacy. Her body was treated as property. Male honor and family interests determined the severity of consequences. Captive women were sometimes incorporated into marriage as spoils of war. Literature celebrated these acts, framing coercion and domination as romantic conquest. The normalized fantasy of being won or possessed perpetuated a culture where coercion was eroticized. Female education focused on decorum obedience and social presentation rather than intellectual or emotional autonomy. A woman's value was measured by beauty, virtue, and compliance, not personal desires or talents. This reinforced the idea of romantic ownership and hierarchical control. Marriage often signaled the transfer of property rather than love. Negotiations resembled commerce. Families traded daughters as part of strategic alliances. Affection was optional, secondary to economic and political advantage. True desire was risky and potentially dangerous. Chivalric codes demanded proof of loyalty through danger and sacrifice. Knights were expected to risk life and limb to demonstrate devotion, legitimizing aggression and physical dominance as markers of affection. Courage equated to love, and the absence of danger implied emotional insufficiency. Ultimately, medieval romance was a carefully structured system of suffering ownership and societal theater. Love was intertwined with violence, hierarchy, and ritualized control. Happiness and mutual respect were rare. Passion was measured by agony and the capacity to endure tragedy for the sake of appearance and prestige.